At the end of the week, Bernie Sanders looked like the front runner. Just days ago, he and Mayor Pete seemed to be tied. Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren struggling. Amy Klobuchar hanging in. Mike Bloomberg was surging in the polls with his billions to spend looming over the Democratic field. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll talk politics in a little while. But we begin with the New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer. He's proposed an ambitious plan for what he calls universal affordable housing in the city. It includes setting aside 25% of apartments in all new developments to be affordable for low-income households, as well as ending a subsidy for some developers. Also on Stringer's radar, bail reform, the justice system fees and surcharges that he says criminalize poverty. The city budget also has his attention. He calls the mayor's spending plan, quote, minimalist. Meanwhile, the state has a $6.1 billion budget gap, which Governor Cuomo hopes to close by cutting Medicaid spending. Scott Stringer has a full plate. Now, 25% of apartments for affordable housing, how does that differ from the mayor's plan, and how do we define affordable these days?
These are great questions, Sam. Look, everywhere I go in the city, throughout the 5 boroughs, everyone is worried that they can't afford to live in the city that they love. So the longtime residents of our communities who were here in the 70s and 80s, who stayed through the crack epidemic, when the city was on the edge of bankruptcy, they stayed. When real estate and businesses didn't want to invest in so many communities, the pioneers did not run away. And now they're at a point in their lives where, because of gentrification and overdevelopment, they're being pushed out of New York, but they're also being pushed into homeless facilities, and that's not right. The other thing is, we need to continue to make New York City a gateway for new immigrants, from people who live around the United States, people who live in Ohio and Iowa and all the places. People want to come to our city. But the entrance fee now is a $1 or $2 million condo. So we need a fundamental shift in our housing plan. City government must be at the forefront of building real affordable housing for the people who need it the most. So my plan is to say to luxury developers, if you're going to build these big skyscrapers that sit half empty anyway, we have to set aside 25% of those units for real low-income housing to integrate our communities, but also stabilize our communities. That's one part of my plan. The second part is, look, we have 30% of New Yorkers who are working who live in homeless shelters. We're now spending $3.2 billion managing a homeless crisis, not fixing a homeless crisis. So I want to build real low-income housing on city-owned land, and then let nonprofit organizations manage those properties, build those properties, and then we can create the tens of thousands of units that can shift people from homeless shelters into real affordable housing. Now, what's the precedent for this? Well, LaGuardia built public housing in the 1930s.
He built it with federal money, though, for the most part.
That's right, because he had that special relationship with President Roosevelt, and everyone knows the story. He would go cry in the Oval Office, talk to Roosevelt, convince him, and Roosevelt would throw him out of the office, but he would have the money to build the housing. Now, it's hard to imagine Mayor de Blasio going to Washington and talking to Donald Trump, but there is a likelihood that we'll have a Democratic president. But think about history, and you know it better than anyone in the city. Mitchell-Lama was built in the 50s and 60s. It was housing that was spurred on by Rockefeller and Lindsay and the legislature. That was the housing for the middle class for the last 40 years. Koch gave the abandoned buildings. He said, look, nonprofits, take those buildings, turn them into something in the South Bronx and other places. And unfortunately, the de Blasio administration sort of did it differently. They tried to make a deal with luxury developers to build affordable housing, and the way they did it was cherry-pick rezonings in certain communities, mostly black and brown communities, and what they ended up doing was spurring gentrification. The housing that they call affordable is not affordable for the people in those neighborhoods.
You talk about overdevelopment. How do we reconcile creating density, building more buildings, building higher buildings to have more people and more apartments with the feeling that people don't want their neighborhoods more dense, more congested, more crowded?
Well, I don't take that view. I think we have to build and we have to increase density to build affordable housing. I believe that if we have a robust community engagement plan at the local level, talking with community leaders, building consensus, people will support density if they are at the table. This is what I was able to do when I was Manhattan Borough President. But you can't go into a community and tell them what they should have. So if you said to a neighborhood, look, we can stabilize the community, we can integrate the community, we can actually build real affordable housing, well, I think people are going to adapt that. And part of my plan is to simply mandate that affordable housing so we don't have to get into disputes with communities. We can then look at other ways the city mayor and the city council can add value to a neighborhood. And I think we need a better conversation. I'm
sure you watched the Democratic debate in Nevada. Was Mike Bloomberg as bad a mayor as he was made out to be? Was he a racist in pushing stop and frisk?
Look, there's a lot of policies under his watch that he admitted was not in the best interests of a lot of our neighborhoods, a lot of communities of color.
Well, he only said one.
Well, that was a big one. You know, I was against stop and frisk, came out and said it wasn't right. We ended up criminalizing innocent people, throwing black and brown children up against the walls of cars and walls in the city. And it's had a lingering impact on a generation of young people. I remember when grandparents and parents would say to me they were more afraid for their black son to go get milk in the neighborhood, not because of the criminal on the street, but the cop on the beat. And he had to deal with that at the debate, and that is a legitimate issue for the campaign. Now, in full disclosure, I'm for Elizabeth Warren, and I think she has put herself out there with real plans, a real agenda that people can analyze and think about. And you know, having said that, I do think the mayor has a right to run. He's running. I do think he has good intentions for the country. He certainly is somebody who is as fearful of Trump as the rest of us. But look, you got to get out there and put your record out there for scrutiny. And you can't only do that with a 30-second commercial. So he debated last night. He's going to debate in South Carolina, and he's going to have to prove himself.
You've described the mayor's budget as minimalist. Is that good or bad?
Well, I said it was minimalist proposals. This is year 7 of his administration. I do think, and I'll talk about this when we do our budget analysis, but I do think we have to look at saving more money, making sure we're investing in programs that allow us to see whether programs are working. We're measuring the success of programs. I'm very concerned that we went from spending $1.4 billion for homeless services. We're now spending $3.2 billion. I mean, that's...
And we now have something like 70,000 homeless people.
And homelessness is up by 11% and climbing, meaning the programs and the strategies are all wrong. Obviously, I've been a critic of the homeless plan, but I also think that we have to look and be more careful about just throwing money against a wall and seeing what sticks.
At the same time, Elizabeth Warren, your candidate, wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. People in New York say you can't afford to do that, especially the question about tax deductibility being eliminated by the president and Congress. How do you reconcile those two things? How do you get more money from wealthy people without driving them out of town?
Well, look, you want to think strategically. The deductibility issue is real for many people. But look, if you raise taxes in a smart way to pay for good programs, I think people will accept that. People hate having their taxes raised if the city doesn't have a plan for what to do with the additional revenue. If you raise taxes on a billionaire, no matter what you do, that person is going to be a billionaire the next day.
So how do you do it in a smart way?
By looking at what you want to raise taxes on. So for example, I've said we need to triple the number of children who would be eligible for child care. Science says that 0 to 3 brain development in a child is critical. How would we pay for an expanded 0 to 3 program? Well, the way you do that is to ask the largest companies in the city to pay a slight increase in the payroll tax. That would create an entire an entire child care infrastructure. Let's do that and then sell it to the business community. I would say to the business community, if you were to have a real child care plan, you would end up putting 20,000 people, mostly women, back into the workforce. They would earn hundreds of millions of dollars, pay taxes that would offset that small increase in the payroll tax of the largest companies, the top 5% of companies, and then you get value for those increased taxes. And I support that.
Scott Stringer, the city controller, will invite you back to talk about a lot more in this coming year, and of course next year, a mayoral election year. Up next, Mike Bloomberg rolls the dice, takes the debate stage in Las Vegas. We'll talk about the race for the Democratic nomination in a moment.
I'd like to talk about who we're running against. A billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg.
The reason the stop and frisk changed is because Barack Obama sent moderators to see what was going on. When we sent them there to say this practice has to stop, the mayor thought it was a terrible idea.
Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements so we can hear their side of the story?
They say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, not this week. The Nevada Caucus is this weekend, and even though he's not on the ballot there, Mike Bloomberg took part in Wednesday night's debate. Given the hundreds of millions he's spending, no surprise that he took plenty of tough shots from the other candidates. Here's a snapshot of where the contest stands now. The Las Vegas Review-Journal poll has Sanders leading in Nevada, Biden second, Warren third, but the stunner, a new NPR PBS Marist poll, has Sanders ahead, Bloomberg second, topping both Biden and Warren. Buttigieg a distant sixth. That was before the debate. So what's the state of play among the Democrats? How worried about Bloomberg should the other Democrats be? Can anyone stop Bernie Sanders? Johanna Barr is a senior politics editor at The Times, was in Iowa for that chaotic caucus. Jonathan Ellis, also a senior politics editor at The Times. He braved the snows of New Hampshire to cover the primary there. And joining us on the phone from Nevada, New York Times political correspondent Reed Epstein. Reed, tell us, is there any fallout from the debate among Nevada caucus goers? Do we see any change from that debate on Wednesday night?
Well, the thing to remember about the correlation between the debate and the caucus results on Saturday is that 75,000 Nevada Democrats voted early before the debate started. There were 86,000 people who voted in the entire 2016 caucus. And so we don't know how big the total universe of caucus goers is going to be in this contest on Saturday. But the general conventional wisdom at this point is that 2/3 to 3/4 of people cast ballots before this debate even began last night. And so we're not likely to see the effects of this debate until at least next Saturday in South Carolina, and probably not until Super Tuesday, a few days after that.
Reed, assuming that we can even count what happened in Iowa, with all due respect to Johanna, who had to be out there, assuming that everything works well with the Nevada caucuses, how representative is that vote of what goes on in the rest of the country? Iowa, we said, was really not demographically representative. What about Nevada?
Nevada is a different slice of the demographic. Nevada obviously has a lot more Latino voters than Iowa and New Hampshire, which are entirely white states for the primary and caucus electorate. But you're still talking about a relatively small amount of people. The expectations are that maybe there'll be 100 to 120,000 people who participate in Nevada. Think about California. There's 15 million people got ballots in the mail already in California. And so it's a very small slice of the Democratic universe that is making the decisions in these early states. What's new for 2020, is that for the first time you have a candidate who is skipping the 4 early states and making a real play in later in Mike Bloomberg. And we don't know yet how that's going to play, whether voters in California and Texas and the 14 other states and territories that are going to make their decisions on March 3rd, how much influence the results from the early states are going to have on them, or what will they look more to the hundreds of millions of dollars in television advertising that they're being bombarded by Mr. Bloomberg on the airwaves in those states and places where the other candidates just aren't rich enough in their campaigns to do so.
Johanna and Jonathan, Will Wilkinson at nytimes.com said that Bloomberg might have bled on stage if he hadn't been so bloodless. Explain to me how the mayor was so either unprepared or ill-prepared for the two obvious questions he was asked during the debate. He obviously was told not to react or overreact, but how could he have not had better answers for the question about stop and frisk and the questions about the suits involving his company?
It was truly bizarre. I mean, these were the questions that everybody knew was coming, and his campaign team, you know, talked about how he was doing debate prep. They also did a lot to set expectations and, you know, say he hadn't debated in years, and this was his first time on stage, and every other candidate had all this time to warm up. But even with that expectation setting, it was a remarkable performance, you know, and he took a lot of fire from Warren, who was at the top of her game, spoke the most, you know, took all the opportunities that were available to her, and other candidates, you know, Biden, Sanders, Buttigieg, all, you know, joined in as well at points, and it was, yeah, I don't. There aren't really words for it. It was remarkable.
Jonathan?
You could tell that all the other candidates were licking their chops ahead of time, ready to really beat up on Bloomberg. Here's a billionaire coming into a debate where, you know, several of the candidates are really, you know, raging against billionaires, I guess you could say, in this campaign. So they were ready to take him on. We are trying to find out why he didn't seem to be so ready to respond to those attacks. His campaign put out a statement saying, you know, well, it only took him 45 minutes to warm up on the stage, but those 45 minutes must have been pretty excruciating, at least for some of his advisors.
He's not a warm and cuddly person to begin with, but it was fascinating that Shira Scheindlin, the judge in the stop and frisk case, had an op-ed piece in the Times at nytimes.com saying Mike Bloomberg is not a racist, that what he did on stop and frisk was perfectly well-intentioned. It was just ultimately a mistake, or it was an exaggeration and got carried away. Why couldn't he just have come out and said something like that? Now, why did he go into this debate in the first place? It was a gamble. He didn't have to. He's not on the ballot till Super Tuesday. What was the point?
Maybe they will be reassessing that decision. He only made it into the debate at the very last minute. Only the day before the debate did he qualify for it through polling, and there was also some outrage in the party that they had removed the requirement to do enough fundraising to make it in. So he was able to make it in once that fundraising requirement was dropped. But yeah, I mean, you know, we'll see what his camp has to say about how they feel about him showing up there. Look, the debate got huge ratings too. Nearly 20 million people watched. So it's obviously a big opportunity for exposure, even beyond the hundreds of millions of dollars he's spending on TV advertising. So it probably seemed like a good opportunity, and you know, look, maybe he did come off well to some viewers. We'll have to see what the polling shows, but you know, it was obviously a gamble.
Reed, we obviously have a sort of insular view in New York. Is there any sense in Nevada as to who won that debate, or at least who came out ahead?
Well, you know, the general consensus is that Elizabeth Warren had a very good night. She showed an aggressiveness that her supporters have been wanting her to demonstrate, frankly, for months, and that she did pretty well. You know, the Pete Buttigieg camp thinks that he performed well in trying to disqualify Mayor Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders from being the nominee. But on these debates, I mean, I think one of the lessons of 2016 is that a lot of us who watch this very closely and cover these debates, we don't necessarily know, certainly the day after a debate, kind of what the ramifications are. You know, we went through this many times over in 2016, watching Donald Trump get pummeled on the stage, only to find out that the viewers who were watching at home loved what he was doing and were only attracted to him more. And so I think there's certainly a consensus that Mayor Bloomberg did very poorly and looked unprepared, and that Elizabeth Warren did well for herself. But I think we're going to need to wait a few days to see some real numbers to determine kind of who this debate was helpful or harmful to.
Johanna and Jonathan, obviously, we're waiting to see the numbers from Nevada. Then we've got other primaries coming up. But Bernie Sanders appears to be surging, at least in the polls. Is there any way to stop him, assuming the Democratic Party wants to do that?
Well, there are a lot of candidates in the field right now who are, all pulling 10 to 12% support, and with that many people, it's hard to see, consensus coalescing around an additional candidate. Bernie Sanders is very popular and has a lot of support in the broader Democratic electorate, and a lot of people of color behind him, a lot of young people. There are lots of reasons to believe that he can build a coalition that will take him to the nomination. That being said, we'll have to see what happens in Nevada. We'll have to see what happens in South Carolina. And then by Super Tuesday, we should have a pretty good picture of if he's going to run away with it or if somebody else has a chance.
Is he such a sharp contrast to Donald Trump that he might win in November and that he can generate lots of enthusiasm? Or is he such a sharp contrast that he's a ready target and that Trump can just decimate him and pin all sorts of labels on him, like Mayor Bloomberg tried to do during the debate?
I think you just laid out the two big arguments, pro and con, for Bernie Sanders that he's putting forth on his own behalf, and then all of his rivals are using to oppose him. I mean, you can tell just watching what Bloomberg was doing, for example. Bloomberg has said over and over again he's going to support whoever the Democratic nominee is. And all indications are he sort of entered this race because he was concerned with the weakness of the other more moderate candidates in the race. You can tell by watching him in that debate. I mean, he's really anti-Sanders, and he has followed that up, the day after the debate with more attacks on Sanders. So, he's obviously running for many reasons, but the argument that he's making is that Bernie Sanders is going to be labeled as a communist, which Sanders says is a cheap shot, but that's what Bloomberg is saying is the big weakness there.
Reed, let me ask you very quickly, and then the other two. Did Joe Biden have any impact in the debate at all?
I thought that it was really striking that everyone on that debate stage took a series of incoming attacks from everyone else on the stage, except really for Joe Biden, who, aside from a couple of sort of glancing blows from Elizabeth Warren, kind of went unperturbed by the other five candidates. It was really a sign of how far former Vice President has fallen in this race, from being the odds-on frontrunner just a few weeks ago to finishing fourth in Iowa and fifth in New Hampshire, and now treated almost as an afterthought by his rivals, that they couldn't be bothered to dissect any elements of his record or his performance on the campaign trail the way that they did with virtually everyone else on the stage.
We'll take that as the definitive answer. Thanks to Jonathan Ellis, Johanna Barr, and Reed Epstein. I'll add my thoughts on CODA next. The best campaign slogan I remember was George Wallace's war cry in his 1968 presidential campaign. Send them a message. It was universal. Them was ambiguous, but we knew who they were. And the message was undefined, which meant it was what you wanted it to be. Mike Bloomberg sent a mixed message this week. For the first time, he was measured live and in person against his Democratic rivals. He fudged, he fumbled, he frowned, he fumed, he was flustered. He refused to plainly face obvious questions for which he should have been fully prepared. Getting into that Las Vegas debate before Super Tuesday was a gamble. He lost. He might still have the best chance of beating Donald Trump and of making the best president, but he blew his debut as a debater. On stage, he appeared to channel Ross Perot's running mate, Admiral Stockdale, wondering, "Why am I here?" Or, listening to his rivals, he wondered, "Why were they there?" What's odd is that he did so much better in 2001 during his first campaign debate. In the Republican mayoral primary, he said that he, quote, came to New York with debts and a dream. And when asked to pose a question to his rival, Herman Badillo, he coyly offered him a job in a Bloomberg administration because, quote, I'd love to have the benefit of your wisdom. This year's Bloomberg slogan has been, Mike will get it done. This week, to whatever degree debating matters, he didn't. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.